Have you ever felt constrained, repressed, trapped within your own mind and body, unable to shake the continually closing feeling of absolute apathy and lethargy that is swallowing you from all sides? Then the human experience is one for you. There is not a single iota of ourselves that can feel satisfied unless we are moving forward. Everything, every day has to be forward, to the next thing, to the next thing, to the next thing, to the next, bouncing off the wall, screaming to the heavens, there is nothing that we cannot do. But, how did this happen? Why are we like this? Why do we lay awake at 2 in the morning, staring at our ceiling, our bodies itching to do everything, yet we lie and do nothing? Well, Donna Haraway, a renowned philosopher and feminist commentator, writes about this very tendency in her work, A Cyborg Manifesto. Haraway's work is about as important as it is hard to understand when you're frantically reading through it about 15 to 20 minutes before class, because last night your best friend who moved away in middle school and is currently living in Los Angeles called you up and wanted you to play this cool new game with him called Escape from Tarkov, and oh shit, it's 2:36 a.m., and you've got to wake up at a decent time tomorrow, or else your sleep schedule will be thrown out of whack again. And it sucks. But anyway, it's like this. Haraway writes that modern machinery is an irreverent upstart god, mocking the Father's ubiquity and spirituality. God has been reduced in our world, not only in the sense that Bible-thumping preachers like to scream to well-indoctrined audiences across America, but also in the sense that it has allegedly removed our need for him. Haraway also states that her writing is an attempt to contribute to socialist feminist culture and theory in a postmodernist, non-naturalist mode, and in the utopian tradition of imagining a world without gender, which is perhaps a world without Genesis, but maybe also a world without end.
Now, we don't have time to unpack all of that.
Except we do, or rather, I do. Let's start with the basics here. There's a substantial amount going on with just this quote, and all of it will be needed to understand how Texhnolzye fits itself within the overall cyborg dialogue. So, firstly, socialist feminist culture, or in other words, the culture associated with people who are socialists and also feminists. Being a socialist is a bit of a nebulous term nowadays, but without resorting to using the phrase the dictionary definition of, which makes me cringe just thinking about, to be socialist is to be in favor of socializing, that is, as opposed to privatizing, things like healthcare, education, and welfare. The people get taxed more so that the government can, hopefully, be able to do more shit. As for what it means to be feminist, again, despite some more recent confusion on the term, it's basically essentially at its most core level someone who subscribes to the radical concept that men and women should be equal. Now, obviously there's more nuance to it than that, with how it's informed different movements over the course of history, such as suffrage, queer rights, Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera were trans women of color, and the Me Too movement. It's absolutely vital to keep this intersectionality in mind when talking about that which we as a society are evolving into. Moving forward, postmodernism is a philosophy generally associated with questioning the systems and civilizations we live in, reacting to the societal norms that we've placed on ourselves, and questioning what was previously held up as inherent or objective truth throughout the ages. Doing this in a non-naturalist way means basically that we're questioning these things and how they relate to that which is not natural, or to that which has been fabricated by humanity. In other words, what are the prevailing ideologies within society relating to the cybernetic, and how can we take those apart? The utopian tradition of imagining a world without gender refers to the pretty prevalent idea among said postmodernist thinkers, ranging from teenagers on the internet to college professors, that ideally, whatever society arises out of the ashes of this current one should do away with the societal construct of gender, rather than continuing to necessitate a distinction between gender and sex that people just don't seem to understand. However, as some non-cisgendered individuals will tell you, this holds its own set of problems. It's the last part of Haraway's description of her writing, however, that most resonates with the core thematic elements of director Hiroshi Hamasaki and writer Chiaki J. Konaka's 2003 anime, Texhnolzye. Texhnolzy's existence is very much a product of its time, coming out right in the thick of anime's weird auteur boom in the late 90s and early 2000s, spearheaded by the release of Hideki Anno's Neon Genesis Evangelion, and to a lesser extent, Mamoru Oshii's Ghost in the Shell adaptation. For a period of about 12 years, from Eva's release in 1995 to the end of 2007, anime found itself in the middle of a quote auteur renaissance, not unlike what critics and writers have coined the period of American film during the late 1960s and early 1970s. The anime released during this time reflected significant cultural anxiety in Japan, birthing easily the most postmodernist and sociologically critical age that the genre has seen to this point. Where the experimental shows releasing in the 1980s were more focused on pushing the medium to its breaking point alongside a golden age of funding and labor conditions, at least comparatively, during Japan's economic bubble, the anime created within this time period were focused much more were on squeezing every last drop they could out of limited resources. Due to the entire country being in an economic recession, funding for animation was obviously much harder to come by. Naturally, if people are struggling to produce enough income to make it month to month, they're not going to be able to have the chance to purchase DVDs and video cassettes in order to support their favorite TV anime. With this taken into account, the art house anime began to rise in popularity. As studios looked at the financial success of Neon Genesis Evangelion and Ghost of the Shell, in addition to genre stalwarts such as the Mobile Suit Gundam franchise, most of the creative staff from those productions were hired on to helm new projects at other studios, as executives looked at those shows and went, do that. Directors such as Shoji Kawamori, who had found success in the 90s with his Macross Plus OVAs, or original video animations, were given the chance to create original IPs that were more off the beaten path, such as his writing for Tenku no Escaflowne and directing Chikyu Shoujo Arjuna in 2001. Shinichiro Watanabe, another director on the Macross Plus project, was given the chance to be the creative mind behind one of the genre's most ubiquitous and critically acclaimed offerings worldwide, Cowboy Bebop. Texhnolzye stands as a testament to the amount of creative freedom some creators were given at this time. Director Hiroshi Hamasaki, while an already experienced animator, got his first full-time directing job helming Texhnolzye. He was paired with an already established powerhouse battery of writer Chiaki J. Konaka and character designer Yoshitoshi Abe, whose previous collaboration, Serial Experiments Lane, was overseen by Texhnolzye's chief producer, Yasuyuki Ueda. Finally, another notable name associated with the production would be that of director for episodes 12 and 18, Sayo Yamamoto. Yamamoto at this point was still a few years removed from her own directorial debut in 2008 with Michiko to Hatchin, but has since grown into one of the most prominent social progressives within the industry, with the aforementioned Michiko to Hatchin and Lupin III, the woman called Fujiko Mine, in addition to the most recent and controversial Yuri on Ice as feathers in her directorial cap. So, while I will not be holding a final exam after all of that, all this history is to say that Texhnolzye is a series deeply rooted within the anxiety of the times its creators thrived in. Its conception and creation likely would not have been possible if not for the specific gathering of creatives during this specific time. Texhnolzye sets itself in a decrepit, crumbling facade of a town. Husks of what are supposed to be citizens trudge along the streets aimlessly, looking to do nothing more than just make it to the next minute, to the next second almost, with the tenuous balance of their meager lives intact. Some look to disrupt this balance, such as the Organo administration, which has wrestled control of the city away from the priests who live in its outskirts. The Cultist Salvation Union and the shifty Rakan group also do their parts to both stir chaos within the city. Towards the end of the series, it is revealed that the city itself is comprised of only those whom the governing body on the surface deemed to be impure of thought or deed and were rounded up and were subsequently either killed or herded into the underground city. The means of separating the underground citizens comes across even further from the introduction of Texhnolzye limbs. The Organo administration's most famous method of dealing with its insubordinates is not to kill them, but instead to lop off a limb or two, forcing their enemies into further misery by rendering them disabled for however much longer they manage to live in an already unforgiving society. The more affluent of these, relatively speaking, are able to afford roughed-up, Texhnolzye prosthetic limbs in order to replace the ones lost. In their society, to have access to technology, or to have access to technolization, separates one as superior to the rest of the class, the name given to the citizens of looks. This system is not unlike what many Japanese lawmakers and citizens were fearing during the early 2000s. As Tokyo and other metropolitan centers have continued to further urbanize Japan, anxiety regarding the fate of the now vacated rural centers continued to grow. Per the World Bank database, Japan's urban population skyrocketed at the beginning of the 2000s, sitting at 78.65% in 2000 and hitting 90.81% at the beginning of 2010. There was, and still is, a growing stigma at these times regarding those who had not been able to yet urbanize their lives. Events such as the Fukushima nuclear disaster and 2011 Tohoku earthquake and tsunami, wherein multiple government officials were indicted for prioritizing urbanized land over rural land during reconstruction, have only further exacerbated these ideas. Texhnolzye warns against the brewing idea that access to technology and being proficient in its use makes one inherently superior to those who are unable to or decide not to harness such technology. Haraway says that as a society, we have intrinsically adapted technology into our beings, whether that technology is antiquated, such as a letter, or modern, such as texting or emailing. Texhnolzye says through its hellish cityscape and the presentation of the Organo as maniacal and militaristic, that such hubris moves us towards the rejection of our own humanity as the Organo do in the series' closing episodes. Technology is a useful ally able to change the course of history on a macro scale for the better, and also help out on a micro level, allowing for those across the country to keep in touch with family that much more easily. However, as Texhnolzye shows with the militaristic Organo, technology that aims in the augmentation of human traits, and as Haraway writes about the cyborg's infatuation with warfare, just as much harm can be done as good. Haraway writes that, quote, modern war is a cyborg orgy coded by command, control, communication, intelligence, and $84 million in the 1984's U.S. defense budget. Violence is an inherent aspect of the cyborg's existence, and Texhnolzye pulls no punches in its reference to this. Our protagonist Ichise, voiced by Satoshi Haga, after all, is first introduced to us shortly after an underground prize fight from which he earns just enough money to be able to feed himself after losing his limbs. No organization in the city is immune to conflict, as the infighting between all three groups serves as the catalyst for the city's eventual self-destruction. Ichise's existence, even after acquiring his new limbs, is one wrought with endless conflict, as even on the anemic surface world he is chased by the bloodthirsty Toyama. Even Ichise is uncomfortable with the implications of his newly technolized limbs, asking the doc, voiced by Shizumi Niki, "You call this piece of shit my arm?" Technology has involuntarily made its way into Ichise's being despite his many protestations. However much better his new limbs are than his old ones, there's still a longing within him for that which is familiar, that which he can know and understand. This is not unlike the aforementioned massive shift into urbanization in Japan. For centuries, the country had been centered around its rural communities, intertwined by different ruling parties and at least theoretically united under strong governing principles. This break from that time-honored environment and the anxiety from it shows itself in Ichise's anger. The intensity of the series' conflicts are that much more contrasted with its quiet, contemplative ending. At the end of the series, humanity fades from existence without much ceremony. After Onishi, voiced by Hiroshi Tsuchida, the leader of the Organo, has been eviscerated by the mob of people in front of the obelisk which gives power to all technolized limbs and looks, the shapes, said to be the next step in humanity's evolution, immobilize and begin their stasis. Meanwhile, the rest of the surface world people are either killed or live on in apathy until the universe entropies. Expanding on the timeless nature of the cyborg in relation to its genesis or end, Haraway writes that, quote, "The cyborg would not recognize the Garden of Eden. It is not made of mud and cannot dream of returning to dust. Cyborgs are not reverent. They do not remember the cosmos." End quote. Yoshi, voiced by Takashi Inoue, a visitor from the surface world to the city, remarks that, quote, "This place is definitely brimming with living energy." After spending the day touring the city, nearly getting mugged and killing 2 people, despite the apparent desolation underground, there is still life moving forward, however bleak and apathetic it might seem. The people in this city have no concept of philosophical maxims, or where they came from, or where they're going. They are attempting to live even if it means just subsisting. And yet they are unable to do this due to the cyborg's influence. There is no beginning for someone once they are made part of the shapes. They are faceless in a horde of automatons existing at the behest of their controller. There is no end for the people of looks either. Even though the world atrophies and dissolves into nothing, just as Ichise fades away as the series ends, they will awaken again, ready to begin the cycle anew. Evolution is a cyclical process that will never truly stop until the universe has lost all of its energy. But even then, what are we supposed to conceive of as our end? What does it mean to no longer have any energy? What would those final moments look like at the end of time, whenever the last living being uses up the final drop of force that gives itself and everything around it life? But perhaps, Texhnolzye says, there is an alternative. That the cyborg in whatever form it currently possesses, be it technology, ghost in the shell, or technolized limbs, can be controlled and manipulated for a better good. Perhaps in, say, a socialist feminist society hinged on postmodernist and utopian thinking. It's like this. Texhnolzy's narrative encompasses all of one aspect of the cyborg's existence, from its role as political commentator to omnipresent but nearly undetectable entities in society, and from its role in creating orgasmic warfare to its peacemaking ability. The key is hanging on to the correct side. Great technological advancements are about to be made, and the key to using them properly is an understanding and a rationality that we currently have been unable to establish in our society. The Organo represent the worst of our society, but not in a way that's overly evil or diabolic. They're suave, dress nicely, speak well, and claim to fight for the common man. As Yoshi observes, those who assert the fact that they are alive are under the rule of the Organo. The Organo have made a point of establishing a class system within the city. If you've got money, you're with them. If you're technolized, you're with them. If you're not either of those things, you sit and rot in the city. But it's the subtlety with which this bigotry is established that allows for the message to actually be understood. Our protagonist even spends a decent chunk of the narrative working for and or lying with the Organo. It's at the end, when Onishi is ripped to shreds and the world goes to hell, that we as the audience can actually understand what the show is all about. Not about rejecting body enhancements or artificial intelligences. Not about being scared what the future holds in terms of scientific innovation and new horizons for technology. Rather, what we should be scared of and working to prevent is an organization like the Organo taking over the means of production, distribution, and governance of these things. To conclude, Texhnolzye serves as a cautionary tale for those who do not fully understand the extent to which the cyborg can influence society, and how far it has already gone in doing so. There are many technologies that can be described as cybernetic, and all of them must be understood, identified, and then put under the care of the right people. They must be used in conjunction with what is actually perpetuating a socialist feminist ideology, plainly stating that their intention is not to create inequality within the classes, sexes, genders, races, or degrees of neurodivergence, but rather to erase those gaps such that everyone is on equal standing with one another, both socially and economically. Lux's problems as a city run twofold. Firstly, its origin story is the anime equivalent of an unironic modest proposal. Secondly, as a lawless capitalistic society that continues to exploit even the most low-down, beaten-up citizen for every drop of blood and sweat that it can, as those on the top flail around trying to hold their positions. And yet, reiterating Yoshi's observation, there is still living energy in this beaten-down society. There is still life, still hope, and the two ruling societies, the Organo above the class, and the surface dwellers above the Organo, reject it in favor of a few years of pleasure before what they perceive as an inevitable end. Haraway writes that, quote, "From one perspective, a cyborg world is about the final imposition of a grid of control on the planet. From another perspective, a cyborg world might be about lived social and bodily realities, in which people are not afraid of their joint kinship with animals and machines, not afraid of partial identities and contradictory standpoints. Single vision produces worse illusions than double vision or many-headed monsters." The, quote, "single vision" of the upper class and governing bodies of Texhnolzy's world ended up dooming them. Now, is Haraway advocating for some kind of kumbaya centrism wherein everyone's perspective, no matter how nonsensical or bigoted, is considered? Not hardly. Socialist feminist perspectives are what the cyborg is concerned with, at least when referring to the second outcome. So I'll ask you again. Have you ever felt repressed? Constrained? Trapped within your own mind and body? Unable to shake the continually closing feeling of absolute apathy and lethargy that is swallowing you from all sides? Then grab a hold of a cyborg or three and go do some cool stuff.